Matthew, we live in times of significant political uncertainty and unprecedented technological change. We're here to speak today about AI and geopolitics, and I think it would be quite instructive to at least reflect on similar periods in history where we've seen significant change. You and I have presented on this topic before. We have a couple of slides that help illustrate some of the topics that we'll be talking about today, and I thought perhaps it'd be really useful if you could take us through those briefly.
Well, thank you very much, David. As you say, it's a hugely topical issue. I think the past is obviously not a guide to what's going to happen in the future, and I wouldn't pretend to be able to make any kind of prediction at all. But if we look at this first slide, what you can see there is 3,000 years of human history. And there are 6 lines on it which are showing things like GDP per capita, energy capture, percentage living in absolute poverty, percentage living in a democracy, those kinds of things, ability to make war as well. And then a series of major epoch-making points of history which are charted on it, whether it's the fall of the Roman Empire or the Anlushan Rebellion in China or the Black Death or big things like that. And you basically see that nothing sort of changes until you hit the Industrial Revolution starting in Britain in the late 18th century. And then suddenly the whole thing just goes off the scale upwards. And then I think it's quite instructive to look at what that actually meant in terms of what people were doing in the economy. And so if we look at this second slide, this shows the evolution of the US labor force from 1840 to sort of roughly now. And you can see there that in the manufacturing economy, the industrial economy, there's a sort of small increase and then a small decrease as machinery becomes more efficient and so forth. But broadly speaking, the industrial economy employs around 30% of the workforce. And in the agricultural economy, you see a huge decline. In this case, from 50% down to sort of 1-2%. There are even larger figures than that. I think if you trace the evolution of the agricultural economy in Britain, you go from something closer to 80% down to 1-2% over a 150-year period. And then there's huge growth in the service economy from 30% up to 70%. And I think what that tells us is that this enormous transformation brought about by technology, brought about fundamentally by the ability to harness physical force for the first time in history in a way that enabled mechanical things to be done by machines on behalf of people, under the control of people, radically changed the world of work, caused an enormous number of jobs in the agrarian economy to disappear, and created a huge number of jobs in the service economy. And I think if you look at the left-hand end of that employment chart, where the service economy is around sort of 30%, maybe a bit lower, the jobs that were then created over the next 150 years were not conceivable to the people at the beginning. And the shape of the economy that we have at the end of that period of transformation, again, not really conceivable at the beginning. And I think for me, that's the most important lesson. I have no clue what jobs will be created by the technological transformation that we're going through. Some suggestions maybe of what jobs will be destroyed by it or modified by it. And I think certainly in the early stages, we're talking about more about modification than destruction of jobs. But there will be a huge change. I think that's the one prediction that we can confidently make.
So I'm very interested in this topic of dislocation in the employment, in the field of employment. I enjoy and welcome the opportunity to work with many of our clients on AI-related matters, both those clients that are developing AI solutions and those clients that are embracing AI and using it in the workplace. And I think there's obvious significant benefit for companies that organize themselves around efficient, effective use of AI. But at the same time, as you say, while perhaps initially we're seeing augmentation of human effort in the workplace and the ability that AI brings to enable people to work more efficiently, it's indubitably creating the potential for disruption and very significant changes in the job market. And I think personally, I see no reason why the developments in AI are not going to have as significant, or frankly more significant, impacts as we saw in the Industrial Revolution, and probably more rapid as well. And so at a more macro level, have concerns about the ability of individuals to retrain in time into whatever the new jobs are that will be created. And for that matter, for nation states to support them, particularly when economies are very strained at the moment. There are other, perhaps more pressing priorities for many as well, to be able to actually manage that dislocation in a way that doesn't cause some significant threats to governments and possibly democracy. I'd be interested to know what your thoughts are on that.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think preparing for that dislocation is really important. I liken it to the Industrial Revolution. It was about the ability to apply energetic force in a controlled way. With AI, it's going to be much more about the ability to apply knowledge and information, though there will, through robotics, also be a development of how you apply physical force and capability. I mean, clearly, we need people who are educated in such a way that they are adaptable to this new economy. And that involves looking both at our core education system and at lifelong learning and education for those who are going through the process of dislocation. I think there's a responsibility for employers there as well to be working to help define what these skills look like. What is it that you need to be able to do, need to know how to do in order to be able to navigate this dislocation with confidence? And obviously there are economic implications, as there always are with the dislocation. I would say I don't think this is, and I agree with you also about the speed with which it may happen, but I don't think this is a sort of a one-off hinge point. I think it is an evolutionary process which actually started some decades ago, but is accelerating now and will accelerate further as we go forward. And so we probably have some lessons that we've already learned in at least some countries that you could look at and see how education systems have adapted already and how that has helped to prepare the working population for an accelerating pace of change.
Do you have particular jurisdictions in mind in that context? Because I fear, perhaps wrongly, that the UK is not as far ahead as it could be in terms of making sure that our the younger members of the society are being taught what they need to be taught and being equipped for the future.
I think I lived for a few years in Finland, and it won't surprise you to know that they, as a very technologically advanced country, have a very advanced education system, I think, in this area as well, though I think the Finns would be the first to say that they haven't perfected it, and there is more work to do. I think it is easier to do in a smaller society. You asked about the impact of all of this for democracy, and I think there are sort of immediate threats of AI to democracy through deep fake technology and that kind of thing. Actually, democracy has proved pretty resilient to that so far. Let's see. We need to keep an eye on it, and we need to make sure that our democracies are able to function in a properly transparent way. But I think the bigger long-term threat is if the dislocation happens too quickly and you have a very large, disconnected, disaffected population who feel that the world has left them behind. That obviously poses an enormous challenge for any government. And so for government to be understanding how the pace of change is developing and how that is affecting people in the world of work, I think is probably one of the primary tasks of government for for the next decades to come.
Let's talk a little bit about the point you mentioned around the need for transparency for democracies to function effectively. We are seeing the emergence of a number of tech giants, and I appreciate that maybe over time there may be some changes in those that are most dominant, but nevertheless, many of the world's biggest companies that have invested the most significant amounts in AI, have developed their own Gen AI platforms, have access to vast amounts of information about each of us through the different platforms that they also own, as well as a significant ability to control the content and messaging that people see through channels of media distribution, be it whether it's through messaging apps or social media platforms and so on. And so these few companies seem to have significant dominance over the use of Gen AI, deep insights into each individual user of their platforms, as well as potentially many other users, and the ability to micro-target content and information in a way that has the potential to not only influence the way people vote, but to shape the way they think. And so I just want to come back to that point about transparency and democracy and understand to what extent you have concerns actually about whether or not there is a risk to democratic institutions in light of that control that a few very large corporates may have over content and messaging.
I think it depends partly on how society arranges the regulation of technology within society. And this is clearly something that regulators in many democracies are looking at, the role of technology in relation to elections. I think it depends also on how those very large tech platforms view their own role. Are they promoters of a certain political philosophy, or are they neutral reflectors of the state of debate in society? Either way, they will be accelerators of opinion because that's the way the algorithms work. But if they're accelerating opinion according to a particular political philosophy, as opposed to accelerating opinion in a sort of neutral way, they will play a different role in relation to democracy. I think what matters is that you know what they're doing. I have great faith in the ability of the electorate to understand the system in which it's operating. And if you know that a given platform is nudging you, helping you to think through a certain type of political philosophy, and another platform is going to amplify your own sort of political starting point, over time, people will figure out how to use the capabilities of these platforms. So I'm optimistic over the long term that these are not a threat to democracy. I think there is a possibility of distortion in the short term. And I think we do need to be very vigilant to the ability of potentially hostile or antagonistic jurisdictions using tech platforms through bots, through automated sort of pumping of messages into the system to distort the picture that emerges. And so long as we're vigilant to that, I would hope that we can arrive at a position in which the tech platforms are transparent about how they see themselves playing their role, and therefore an understanding of what they're doing is clearer. And I would say I'm very struck talking to my daughter's generation, people in their 20s. They have a much more intuitive understanding of what they're looking at on social media than someone of my generation does, where I tend to take everything at face value. But then I look at much less social media than they do. So I think there are evolutions in how we use the technology as well, which will help us.
We exist in a world where the more significant tech companies are valued at levels above the GDP of many nation states. And we are also witnessing, I think, the emergence of probably, from a geopolitical perspective, the emergence of two major blocs in terms of AI, namely the US and China. Quite interested to understand your thinking around how those two different areas of influence, whether we're talking about corporate influence or political influence, may play out, and whether you think other nation states are jeopardized by the emergence of perhaps a real level of dominance in a small number of companies and probably two significant political blocs.
Well, let's start with the two political blocs. I mean, clearly, China and the United States are way ahead of anywhere else in the world, and I don't see how anywhere else in the world will catch up with them in terms of the overall level of investment and innovation that's happening in this area. The European Union obviously aspires to, but I think starts from a long way back, and also starts from a regulatory position that just makes it harder. And as such, I think will really struggle to catch up. So if you then look at China and the US, it seems to me the difference between the two is that the US is fundamentally private sector led. It's a bunch of companies who are innovating in competition with each other, creating capability in competition with each other, and moving at formidable speed in doing so. In China, although a great deal of the development is happening in companies, and many of them privately owned companies and run by entrepreneurs, it's happening within a much more structured government framework. And as such, the technology is intrinsically under greater public authority control from the start than it is in the US. And so I think these two sets of innovation have very different characters to them, and we'll see that as they develop. I would expect, I don't know, but I would expect Chinese AI development to have greater homogeneity about it because it's happening within this more regulated overall sort of government-led concept, and American AI to have a more competitive innovation intensity to it, and as such potentially to be exploring more dangerous areas and pushing into areas that we need to be careful about. My own view of the relationship between innovation and regulation is that you should wait until harm occurs and then use regulation to correct the harm. I think there is a question with AI whether we will spot the harm and be able to react to it in a regulatory sense fast enough to make sure that serious harm doesn't occur in the way that we have in sort of foodstuffs and health and safety and all these other areas where regulation keeps us safe. But I think we're at the early stages. And the other thing that I think we're starting to see develop, but we haven't seen yet fully develop, is how these very, very large companies, which are capable of making the huge investments to create platforms, innovation platforms, capability platforms, how they then interact with the ecosystem of sort of startups and smaller companies who develop capability off the back of the big companies and create new capabilities for us, including potentially the capability to control what some of the big companies are producing, which is less constrained by the big companies themselves. So I think there is. You're absolutely right that there are two jurisdictions, but I don't feel it's right to look at them as though they are the same thing. I think they have very different attributes to them, and we see that in the way what's emerging from them works.
If we accept that we are seeing the emergence of two AI superpowers, do you think this is going to drive, at a geopolitical level, polarization amongst other nation states? They're going to have to ally more closely with one or the other, quite separately. I know we're not talking about tariffs, but I'm quite interested to know how you think, if there's one force driving towards polarization and other forces driving towards perhaps greater isolationism. It'd be interesting to understand how you think that might play out.
So I think there is clearly a risk of that happening, and to an extent, it's already started in the debate around technology security in networks and so forth, which is pushing towards an element of polarization at the infrastructure level, and that could well start to happen at the service level as well. And jurisdictions other than China and the United States could find themselves making choices as to which they're going to use, either at governmental level or more organically within society in the adoption of services and so forth. How does that link to the sort of broader shape of global economic interchange? I think we've come away from 30 years of sort of globalized, completely free trade, where you could more or less sell anything, buy anything, hire anyone, invest wherever you wanted to, wherever it made most economic sense to do it. We've come into a world which is more one of competing centers of geo-economic power, if you like. And I think the technology is reflecting that. And that's something that we're just going to have to navigate. To my mind, it's a pity, because I think one of the remarkable things that the internet and the World Wide Web have done in their early stages is to bring a level of technology service and technology capability to some of the poorest people on the planet, which has made an enormous difference to their lives. And it would be a retrograde step for humanity as a whole if we failed through division in the way the AI world develops to deliver those same kinds of benefits.
One issue that concerns me in particular, and which I haven't previously heard discussion around, is that nation states across all the developed economies, as well as others, are struggling under the burden of costs of the public sector. We're seeing tax rates at their highest levels. And it's clear that there isn't a lot of slack in the system to be able to support individuals who are being displaced from work ahead of them being able to retrain, find other jobs. And of course, one hears talk about different kind of approaches to welfare solutions, universal basic income and that sort of thing. But if at the same time, the major owners of the AI technology that is likely to be used, that will have this dislocating effect, are in other countries, and therefore revenues will flow into those countries, tax take will increase in those countries, but it won't increase in the countries that are left behind that are not AI superpowers. One can't help but being left with the concern that there are going to be quite a few countries that may not be able to find an easy way to afford the support of a population where a material percentage find themselves out of work. And I just wonder whether you think governments are confronting this. Well, first of all, whether or not you think this is a real issue. Secondly, if it is, whether or not you think governments are confronting this effectively, planning for it, and whether you're seeing any particular countries around the world taking proactive steps.
I think it's a potential problem, but I think there are solutions to it as well. And I think that part of that lies in the fact that, yes, you're absolutely right. The big platforms will do what big platforms do, what big platforms have always done. If you look at the desktop computing systems that are used in offices around the world, they very, very largely come from one company, but they deliver benefits in many, many countries. And many countries see in their tax revenues, in their public sector and private sector productivity, the benefit of what that one company provides. If you look at enterprise resource management systems, there's one German company, one American company, and virtually the whole, at least of the OECD world, is using one of those two systems to manage virtually every enterprise. And a lot of the benefit of that stays in the country in which the system is being used. And I think the same will be true of AI. And that links slightly to what I said earlier about the sort of ecosystem of AI startups and AI innovation companies, which are creating capability off the back of the big platforms that are there. As you see that happening, that is more likely to be more localized in order to fit with the societal and cultural norms of the place in which it's happening. And so, yes, a proportion of the value created will be flowing back to the very big platform companies, but a significant proportion of it will be staying in the jurisdiction in which it's happening. And then I think the second dimension, particularly with AI, is that I think AI will create a huge problem of dislocation, as we discussed earlier, but it can also create some of the solution to that. I can see AI tutors helping re-educate people so that they're capable of new forms of work. I can see AI transforming public service in quite radical ways, so that the burden of a lot of public service on current fiscal regimes is alleviated in ways which creates more fiscal headroom to support people through the transition. So I think it's something that requires careful navigation and a lot of attention, but I don't think it's necessarily a wholly negative relationship.
Yeah, I think that's hopefully probably right too. I had an interesting discussion with a friend a couple of days ago on this topic, and one of the things he raised that I thought was particularly hopeful was that actually what we may see is larger companies potentially reducing the workforce in the short term, although obviously they'll be hiring people who can specialize in the most efficient and productive use of AI as well at the same time. But smaller companies, perhaps, that have particularly struggled to grow because of their current cost base, may well be able to actually expand. And so I think that is quite an interesting insight into the way the economy may develop, as well as with the creation of jobs that we can't possibly contemplate right now.
I think that's absolutely right. So if you take a sort of concrete example of, let's say, a plumber, I'm an individual plumber. I manage my business at the moment, essentially using my phone. I've got my van full of stuff. People ring me up. I go around and work for them. And I'm sort of more or less 100% productive, because if I'm working, I'm earning. And then I've got slightly too much work, so I find another plumber and we manage stuff between us. And we become marginally less efficient in that we're coordinating a bit between us, but not hugely efficient. And you carry on like that for a bit. And then suddenly you can't actually manage the workflow anymore. You need someone to answer the phone and book in the work and send out the invoices. And that person is somebody who doesn't contribute to revenue, but does cost. And so you suddenly get to a point with a small business where you've got to take a bigger bet on your ability to grow than simply one plumber adding another plumber alongside him or her. And I think that's where AI could really transform things. With, you ring a bot rather than a person, you book in the work. The AI management system enables all of that to happen, make sure that you've got the right parts when you turn up at the job, invoices afterwards, runs the records of your time, and all of that. It could be done in a radically different way to the way in which you conceive of a startup company now. So I think that's absolutely right. I also think that the big companies are never generators of big growth in employment. A big company will start, it'll expand to where it's going to get to, and it will then focus ruthlessly on efficiency and generally not get much bigger in terms of the number of people it has. The growth in employment, and in many ways the growth in economic performance, comes through startup companies, smaller companies, which get going and grow and find a niche in the market that is underserved. And I think AI could help that happen as well, partly as a platform for those companies to use, but partly also as an efficiency provision within a small growing company.
Yeah, I think that's right, and that it provides us with many reasons to be hopeful. Matthew, as ever, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
I'm very optimistic, but I've no idea why. Thank you very much, David.